Today, I want to talk to you about a difficult subject that I've spent the last 10 years studying. That subject is racial terror lynchings. These involve mob violence, torture, and murder, largely of African American and Hispanic people, without the due process of law or any due respect for human life. It's a difficult subject, but I think it's one we need to come to terms with because it's a subject that relates directly to the history of our community. As a historian, I'm also often drawn to the words of Tony Judt, a great scholar of European history, who said that the historian's task is often to tell an uncomfortable story and to explain why the discomfort is a necessary part of the truth so that we can live well and live properly. The truth is important. We must build our societies to be well on truth. My story begins 1 week ago, on March 29th, 2022, when President Joseph R. Biden signed, in this picture, the first federal Anti-Lynching Act into law. The act is named for Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black Chicago native who went to Mississippi in 1955, where he was horribly tortured and murdered at the hands of white supremacists, helping to launch what became known as the modern civil rights movement. The Emmett Till anti-lynching law, passed last week and signed into law, makes lynching a federal crime punishable by 30 years in prison. Yet, shortly after Biden signed the law, he gave a press conference in which he said that hundreds of anti-lynching laws had come before and had been failed, and Congress had failed to pass them. In fact, the first anti-lynching law in U.S. history was presented to Congress in 1900. Since that time, more than 200 anti-lynching laws have been presented and failed. But what I'd like to share with you today is that the laws didn't simply fail to pass. They were rejected by white Southern Democrats mostly, white Southern congressmen and senators, like the four men pictured here. That's Tom Connolly on the left, a Texas senator. In the center, we see Walter George and Richard Russell of Georgia. Richard Russell was LBJ's principal mentor. And on the far side, we see a Florida representative. These four men are conversing in this 1938 photo about the 30-day filibuster they engaged in to prevent the passage of an anti-lynching law. In fact, political scientists have shown us now that between 1917 and 1994, there were 30 laws filibustered to death in the U.S. Senate, and half of them dealt with lynching or civil rights. So, put another way, these bills didn't fail. They were defeated by white supremacists in the South. Now, my hero, one of my heroes, Bryan Stevenson, the civil rights attorney, best-selling author of Just Mercy and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, might say things a little bit differently than I say. He might say it doesn't have that much to do with the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. It doesn't have that much to do with the filibuster. The most important point to get across to an audience would be that most Americans today, and judge for yourself, most Americans today could not name a single African American victim of lynching in the entire history of the United States. Not a single victim of lynching, despite the fact that more than 4,000 African Americans and other people were lynched in this country. That is a startling revelation. In fact, in Texas and other states around the country, legislators are trying to make it more difficult for people to learn about lynching, racism, segregation, slavery. They're passing laws like this one here, Senate Bill 3, passed last year, 2021 in Texas, signed into law by Governor Greg Abbott on September 17th, which is incidentally Constitution Day. And this bill deals with a lot of things in education, but specifically it says that teachers, educators in public school cannot teach, may not teach, that racism or slavery were anything other than a deviation from the authentic principles of the founding of the United States, which include liberty and equality, as a deviation from. So, racism, slavery, discrimination, these were not systemic underlying factors that led to the unfolding of U.S. history, that played a role in our current reality. No, they were aberrations, anomalies, unimportant, not fundamental. This is simply an interpretation of the past that will not stand up to scrutiny. And so, we look back at Texas history, which I do, we will see that after the Civil War and Reconstruction, white Texans created what I call, and what other historians have called, a persecuting society. Maybe many of you have heard of Jim Crow and segregation and disfranchisement, but I want to say that's not enough. That's a simple introduction to the discrimination. We're talking about housing discrimination. We're talking about sharecropping and tenant farming. We're talking about convict lease, physical abuse, sexual abuse. We're talking about anti-miscegenation laws that prevent whites and blacks from marrying one another. We're talking about redlining. We're talking about racial covenants, restrictive covenants to prevent black and Jewish people from moving into white neighborhoods. We're talking about the systemic over-policing and execution of black men in the country by the state of Texas. In fact, Rupert Kinninger, who formerly taught in the sociology department here at Sam Houston State University and was fired in 1962 for his civil rights activism, in 1969 he wrote a famous article about executions in Texas. And he showed that between 1924 and 1968, 58% of the men convicted of capital crimes were black. 58% of the men convicted of capital crimes were black, although black men made up less than 14% of the population. That is systemic racism and injustice. Now, lynching. Lynching was the worst form of white supremacy. It was the ultimate form. It was the form that was used to enforce the other institutional aspects of white supremacy. Early in the 19th century, lynching was used as a frontier form of justice, largely against white people. People who were cattle thieves, horse thieves, card cheats. But after the Civil War and Reconstruction, during the 1880s, as the white supremacists formed the Jim Crow system, they racialized lynching and targeted black and Hispanic men for murder. Now, at our project, Lynching in Texas, we're trying to tell some of the stories of lynching victims. And I want to tell you a story of one of the families that was from right here in Walker County, only a few short miles from where we're sitting, and that was the Cabinets family. Lynched June 1st, 1918. 6 members of the family killed by a white supremacist mob that surrounded their house, set it on fire, and when they tried to escape, shot and killed them. This is an article from the New York Times that blames the Cabinets family for their own murder. And that was common in the white press. White newspapers around the state of Texas blamed the lynching victims for committing crimes for which they would have to be killed. But in actuality, this was not a true story. Because we know that mobs don't surround houses, light them on fire, and then kill the inhabitants in self-defense. And in fact, in research in the archives of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, I found this document, which I know you probably can't read, but I could share with you in another location. But this document is pivotal. It is by the lone survivor of the Cabinets lynching, Bessie Cabinets. And in it, she tells the story of what actually happened. She says at the bottom of the left image, "We were unarmed. We could not defend ourselves. And a white mob surrounded us." And then she identifies who she saw in the mob. The Walker County Sheriff, T.E. King. The Dodge Justice of the Peace, Sam Roark. A Huntsville deputy, C.B. Birmingham. They did nothing to intervene in the burning of the home or the murder of the Cabinets family. And this was indicative of lynching after lynching throughout the state of Texas and the South. Law enforcement officers were part and parcel of what took place. Now, as I said, I run a large web project called Lynching in Texas, and we've now documented more than 700 lynchings that took place in the state of Texas, naming the victims, the crimes they supposedly committed, the date and location of their death. And these lynchings were horrific, like the 1916 lynching of Jesse Washington, a mentally disabled man in Waco, Texas, for murder. That was a spectacle lynching in which more than 10,000 people, white people, participated and watched him be tortured and murdered in a public square. That lynching was followed by the taking of souvenirs. White people from the crowd would come to the lynched body looking for a snippet of hair, a tooth, a bone from the charred remains of the body. And they would take photos. Fred Gildersleeve took dozens of photos of the Cabinets lynching, and they would change them as postcards in the mail to show what their community had done. Well, lynching has a profound effect during the time period, but also in our own time period. The racism and lynching violence that took place in the Jim Crow period was taught to children. This is a illustration from an art exhibit, an anti-lynching art exhibit from 1934 called "This Is Her First Lynching," where a family member hoists a child onto their shoulders so that the white child can see the execution of a black subject. You don't get rid of that kind of racist violence once it impacts the mind of young people. And it continues to filter out through the United States into all types of problems that we face today. Economic inequality, education inequality, violence, police violence, systemic racism. The legacies are many. Thank you very much.